Hello, and welcome to this week's reflections on Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. If you have not already, and I could encourage you please to go below this video on the YouTube channel and subscribe to our channel. And if you find these videos helpful at all, please give us a thumbs up, and that will help us in some kind of a formula to reach more people. Also, I encourage you to share these videos with your friends or neighbors who may be interested in this as well, and direct them to our site. That's always good for us and for you and your neighbors. Also, if you have a comment, a question, or a thought to share, there's a comment section below these videos on the YouTube channel as well. So last time we were into chapter 7 of, 20 or so verses. But I want to go back to verse 20, which also connects with verse 24, in which Paul is advising the readers that each person should remain in the situation they were when God called them. And he was giving them all kinds of advice about how to not make dramatic changes to their life. Now, obviously, that concept needed to be moderated over the last 2,000 years. Remember, Paul was writing to them as if Jesus were returning in any time, in the next day or the next week or next month. But he never imagined 2,000 years later we'd be reading these verses and trying to take them literally, thinking Jesus is going to be here. I can't get married. I can't have children. I can't buy a house or any of those things. We do those things because that's just common sense now, because mostly we live, and many Christians today live as if Jesus is not going to return in our lifetime. We don't know one way or the other, but we live as if he won't be. So a concern, in this year 2026 is that we not become so connected to this life in this world that we become disconnected from our spiritual lives. We may not expect Jesus to return in our lifetime, yet we need to be prepared for that possibility. So we live in the already but not yet, and that's where I left off at the last video. So I want to pick up there, not with Paul's writing in chapter 7 yet, but rather pointing to the gospel reading from Luke chapter 12, verses 13 to 21. And I'm going to list that text on the resource page, but I'm inviting you to read those verses on your own. I won't put them on the resource page. But again, Luke 12, 13 through 21. It's also known in many of our Bibles with the title, The Parable of the Rich Fool. And it's verses that demonstrated a man who was fully prepared to live out his life in this world and completely unprepared for eternal life. The rich man whose fields produced abundantly, so much so that he had to build bigger barns in order to hold it all. And in verse 19, that demonstrates how unprepared this man was for spiritual life. God tells the man, or the man tells God basically, and I will say to my soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be married. In fact, he's not be married, be merry. Sorry, I misspoke. He's telling himself he's got it made. No worries. And then that night, the story says in verse 20, God says to him, you fool, this very night, your life is being demanded of you. And the things you have prepared, whose will they be? And you can see the resource page for that particular verse. Producing abundantly, building bigger barns. Those are not the things that made the man a fool. Okay, don't misinterpret this. What made him a fool was thinking that those things are what earned his soul rest, or we would say salvation. Now back to this chapter 7, verse 25, Paul again points out that he is offering an opinion because he has no command from God to offer. So he's just giving his opinions about things. And again, emphasizing his opinion that these believers should remain as they are without making any dramatic changes in their lives. Why? Because Jesus is about to come back anytime now. In verse 26, he mentions a present crisis. The Greek word for crisis also translates as persecutions, calamities, famine, and so on. Whatever crisis may bring to mind for you. The Greek word for present translates as that which is pressing on. It's not a one and done. It's something that's going to continue. So the persecutions would continue. Calamities will continue, maybe not one after another. Famine will happen. Disaster will happen. So the present is more like this is going on and it will continue to go on. It does not mean anything specific was happening at that particular time in Corinth. It may just mean that the famine, which happened under Emperor Claudius, was well known, and people would think that. Oh yeah, famine, I remember that. It may also mean that the persecutions had already started in some places, and they were being talked about in Corinth, even if they hadn't reached Corinth yet. Throughout the centuries, even into our current time, people still use the same kind of references, a kind of a present crisis, if you will, to guess about the end of the world, which some reference as when Jesus will return. People point to violence, wars, natural disasters, and other such things to validate their suspicion that the world must be about to end. The Bible does not lift those things up as some kind of formula for calculating Jesus' return. Jesus could just as easily return when everything's going perfectly. So don't look at disasters and think, oh, Jesus must be on his way. I mean, the thing could be going perfectly for you and Jesus could show up. Paul's motive in adding this into the discussion on marriage is not to create some kind of theological doctrine about marriage. Rather, Paul wishes to spare them from the many troubles that a married couple could find in this world, because he believes this world is going to be over very soon. We really need to read Paul's advice through the filter that he believed firmly Jesus could return at any day, or maybe next week, maybe next month. He didn't know, but he thought it was imminent. So if a person marries and something happens to the person's spouse, the example would be that their grief would be greater than if it happened to someone that they did not know, or perhaps only someone they knew and that made them sad. But the grief would be greater with a spouse. You'll still grieve for that other person, yet that grief feels different. Verses 29 to 31, Paul returns to this theme of Jesus' imminent return. It's about to happen. He wants them to believe. And the subsequent end of the world is here. So Paul has encouraged people to hold on to the things of this world loosely. And that means anything and everything that is important in this world. which I think is still pretty good advice today, because you never know when your life will end. Like that parable of the rich young fool. And the things that you have prepared, whose will they be? So I encourage people, I use this kind of imagery to imagine all of their possessions as something they can hold in a flat hand with fingers spread apart. What can you hold in that kind of a mode? Not as if you're holding on to things with your fists balled tightly around them and you have no intention of ever letting them go. What can you hold this way that you can't lose? I think that's kind of an imagery that makes sense to me. So if it helps you, that's great. If it doesn't, maybe you have an imagery that will. Verses 32 to 35, Paul's concern for these people is not only because of the present crisis afflicting the world, and those specific to Christ followers, perhaps, as the persecutions were going to ramp up. Paul is also concerned for individual lives and those parts of life that can distract them from their focus on Jesus. So in these verses, Paul names marriage as one distraction, not because it's a calamity, it's not a present crisis, but it can turn out to be a distraction because the relationship between husband and wife can divert each other's attention, at least in part, away from Jesus toward one another. And he is concerned about that because Jesus is coming back at any time now. You need to focus on your relationship with Jesus and not be distracted by your relationship to someone else in this world. And verse 35, he tells them something interesting. He doesn't want to put any further restraints on them, yet he's giving them advice. The Greek word here that we translate as restraint in the New Revised Standard Version, it's usually used in terms where it refers to hunting, and it refers specifically to using a snare to capture the hunted animal. Paul's idea is that he doesn't want them to interpret his advice as just one more law or one more rule or one more doctrine that snares their life. His advice is not meant to burden them. He wants to provide them more freedom to devote themselves to Jesus Christ. So in the long view, in terms of whatever that short time left would be considered a long view, it is for their own spiritual benefit to remain as they are. That is, to spend the time instead of worldly endeavors to grow spiritually mature, to be like Christ. In verse 36, he's still talking about marriage here, and he uses a phrase called behaving indecently. In Paul's time and culture, for the Corinthians at this time and culture, their situation in life, if you will, an unmarried woman of a certain age was a negative thing. Women were expected to be married, start producing children, be the head of the household matriarch, whatever. I know it's all very condescending to women. Don't hear this as my opinion, but it was a reality at the time Paul is writing this letter. It would have been awkward for the woman, especially if she had been already engaged to a man, to stay single. That would have been really awkward. And so Paul is basically saying, well, better to get married than to behave indecently. And if the woman did not go through with the marriage contract, people would wonder what was wrong with her. Okay, again, don't blame the messenger. people would not wonder what was wrong with him. They would wonder what was wrong with her. And Paul does not want to create some kind of awkward situation in the life of the woman. He really did like women. That too many times we read Paul as if he hated women. He didn't. Here you see an instance of this. He doesn't want to create an awkward situation for a woman in her life. So he advises, if the marriage contract is already in place, the two should marry. The other side of that, verse 37, if there is no marriage contract, that is what we would call engaged, if that's not already in place, then Paul advises against getting married because Jesus will return very soon. Okay, that's the filter we need to use in all of this. It's better to remain single, as you were when Jesus called you, and have an undivided devotion to Jesus until his return. Verse 38, again, Paul wants to be clear that neither staying single nor getting married is a sin in their specific time and place. Paul's sole concern here is to make their spiritual life less complicated by making their physical or temporal earthly life less complicated. As stated in verse 24, life will be less complicated for them if they remain in the situation they were when God called them, because Jesus is coming back any moment. Now, verses 39 and 40. In my humble opinion, here Paul offers advice that will end up making life more complicated for widows. Paul's advice would have been sound if Jesus would have come back any moment, or at least within their lifetime. Since Jesus did not return in their lifetimes, widows could have suffered unnecessarily because of Paul's advice here in verses 39 and 40. Widows were not treated well in that time and place because women did not have the same rights as men. So, unscrupulous men could easily and legally even take advantage of a widow, and she could be left homeless and penniless. The first part of this advice I can agree with. If her husband dies, she is free to marry anyone she wishes, only in the Lord. Okay, that only in the Lord part is that if the widow is to remarry, then she's advised by Paul to marry a believer. That'll help maintain the spiritual harmony in the relationship, which will make other parts of their life better. As long as the two remain faithfully committed to living as Christ followers. That is, to follow Christ. Do what Christ did. Verse 40, here's where we have a problem. Paul suggests that it would be better if she stays as she is, that is, stay a widow. In hindsight, staying a widow would likely have caused more suffering for widows because they were not typically well cared for by society. So it turned out to be negative advice, or it have a negative impact at least. They became those who lived on the fringes, those who were outcasts. They were poor, homeless, penniless. They were burdens to society, but the worst part was for them personally. Unless the church people made it their business to look after the widows, they could lead a miserable life until they died, because Jesus did not return. I hope common sense would tell believers today this verse is one of those that you just should not take literally in our 21st century. Widows staying single, that should be a personal choice. And Paul's advice about being more blessed had to do solely with the idea that Jesus' return was imminent. Well, 2,000 years later, Jesus did not return. So Paul's expected blessing from staying single did not prove to be true. It was a mistake. Not based on something Paul intended, yet because of that filter he had that Jesus would be back any moment, he gave bad advice. In my humble opinion, whether widow or widower, stay single, get married again based on your personal choice about what is right for you, okay? End of chapter 7, end of speech on that. If you have not already, you may wish to pause this video and read or listen to someone else read to you chapter 8. Something we know about the church is that people join it from all walks of life. Old and young, rich and poor, Republican, Democrat, Independent, and even unaffiliated. High school graduates, and those with a variety of some form of higher education. White people, people of color, gay and straight. And God's word has been translated into many different languages, representing people from all over the world. The church, or maybe it's better to say it as the body of Christ, is a diverse group in so many ways. And those do not even address the various levels of spiritual maturity. We cannot read Paul, especially in this chapter, which is specifically written about food offered to idols as part of worshiping of another god. Once again, we cannot read Paul and pick out individual verses that we might read alone and might be interpreted all as they stand alone as something Paul never intended. So we need to be cautious about reading Paul and what Paul specifically wrote to one congregation of people on one topic, probably because they asked. So in this chapter, Paul is addressing how to be church while respecting diversity and the various levels of spiritual maturity. That's the point Paul is trying to make. Most likely, the reason he used the subject of meat offered to idols specifically was because the leaders in Corinth asked about it. They brought it up in a letter that they wrote to him. So he's addressing their specific question. Paul is not advocating for or against eating meat or being vegetarian or even being vegan. Trying to claim one or more of these ideas from this text, that's not good exegesis. That would be eisegesis, like I talked about. Exegesis means using good interpretive methods, not just singling out the one verse that I really want to focus on because it makes my point that I've already drawn in my head. Spiritually mature Judeo-Christians and even Gentiles who converted to Christianity, to whom Paul is writing right now in this letter at this time, they knew there are no other gods except the one true God whom Paul has proclaimed to them when he planted this church in a city called Corinth. Less mature Gentile Christians, maybe they recently converted from a pagan background and maybe they worship multiple gods in their previous life, depending upon what their lives needed at any given time, and they needed some kind of spiritual boost. Well, this God was the God of this, the God of that, the God of those, the God of that, blah, blah, blah. So they would go pray and worship and offer sacrifice or that idol, because they needed good crops or they needed whatever. They had a God for everything. We need rain, pray to this God. Less mature Judeo-Christians might still be feeling like they're bound up by the law of the Jewish population. And that law, among the laws, one forbid them from any contact with idols or idol worship, whether directly or indirectly. So Paul is trying to write to two separate groups with different beliefs about one subject matter, meat offered to idols. Now let me share with you some verses out of what we call the Old Testament. They would have called it the Bible. Leviticus 17:7 gives directions to the priests. It writes, they must no longer offer any of their sacrifices to the goat idols, demons, in other words, to whom they prostitute themselves. This is to be a lasting ordinance for them and for the generations to come. Okay, makes sense for the Judeo-Christians. And you can find this on the resource page. Numbers chapter 25, verse 2. This gives instruction, but it's more indirect. While Israel was staying in Shittim, the men began to indulge in sexual immorality with Moabite women who invited them to the sacrifices to their gods. The people ate the sacrificial meal, bowed down before their gods. So Israel yoked themselves to the Baal of Peor, and the Lord's anger burns against them, indirectly saying, stay away from idols. You can see these verses also on the resource page. Now, going back to the Jerusalem Council, if you watched my reflections on the Acts of the Apostles, you heard this already. The Jerusalem Council forbade food offered to idols in their decree that they sent out. They issued from Jerusalem, obviously, the Jerusalem Council. You can read about that in Acts chapter 15, verses 27 to 29. That's on the resource page, but let me read to you. It was written to recent Gentile converts regarding something that the Judaizers claim, that the Gentiles must first become Jewish and then become Christian. So specifically Acts 15, 28 and 29, let me read that. It seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us to not burden you with anything beyond the following requirements. You are to abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from the meat of strangled animals, and from sexual immorality. A very short list. You will do well to avoid these things. Please notice, the Jerusalem Council wanted to not burden people further. They made minimal mandates, very few, very short list. The Jerusalem Council was made up of Jewish people. They were used to living under the law, which was really more than 600 laws that ended up restricting people's freedom so badly that I cannot imagine how they kept everything straight. I've read through those laws. Some of them were so specific as you can't take 10 steps in this direction on the Sabbath. Remember, going back to your Exodus chapter 20, God gave 10 commandments. Humans turned those 10 into more than 600. What are we doing to ourselves? Now go back to hearing the Jerusalem Council saying, it's not our intention to burden you further. In this chapter, Paul does not mention that decree from the Jerusalem Council because Paul supports his teachings with his own apostolic authority based on his calling directly from Jesus. He was not sent out, if you will, under the authority of the Jerusalem Council. Some of the other apostles were. He was sent out under the authority of Jesus Christ. So he wants to talk about being more spiritually mature Christians rather than living under the laws like this, whether it's a Judeo-Christian or a Gentile Christian. He wants them to be sensitive to the less spiritually mature Christians, and eating meat offered to idols is a good place to make a case for the overall general goodwill toward other believers. The portions of the sacrifices not offered on the altar belonged partly to the pagan priest, partly to those pagans making the offering, and they were eaten at the feasts in the pagan temples, in the private houses, and were sold also at marketplace. So those Christians were constantly being exposed to the temptations of receiving this meat offered to idols, directly or indirectly. They could have bought it at the market without knowledge. And that was strictly forbidden by the Jerusalem Council. There may have been more in those congregations at Corinth who had already concluded that meat offered to idols was non-existent gods, not literally contaminated, whether physically or spiritually. They may have been perfectly okay with eating that meat. Meat was meat. I think Paul could have agreed with them to a point, but the breakdown comes when this meat causes one of the other believers to stumble, someone who's less spiritually mature. And if they stumble because, for example, Paul would say, if I eat meat that's offered to an idol, I don't feel bad about it. I know there are false gods and there is one true God. But if I eat meat that's offered to an idol and it makes one of these other younger Christians or less spiritually mature Christians to feel racked with guilt over their sin, then I shouldn't do it. So I want to stop there. I want to get into that a little bit more next time about what that means for today. That's enough for you to process for now, and I'm running up past my time. I apologize for that. So thanks for bearing with me. We're into chapter 8. Next time we'll continue with this discussion on meat offered to idols a little bit. If you happen to be in the Sun City Center area on Sunday at 10 a.m., please join us in person for worship. If you can't do that on this YouTube channel, we'll live stream it on Sunday morning at 10. Then it'll go on to YouTube as a recording, and you can watch it anytime you like after that. I hope you're having a great week. Thanks for bearing with me a little bit longer today. Take care. God bless.